Hey, Eric Next Gen Performance here. Are you looking to swap a car like this? Maybe a car like this? Or maybe you're looking to swap something like this. Whatever you're swapping, you're going to need a budget. And so that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about LS swap budgets. Here we go. First subject for LS swap budget is going to be the car that you choose. And we already did a video on picking a car for a swap, and we'll put a link up here to it. And if you want to check that, I'll check that out. But anyways, so the car that you pick is really going to determine what the swap is going to cost. So condition of the car, maybe age of the car. If it's a newer or older car, you're going to have to do certain things to do the swap. But we're going to get into some of those subjects now. So you got your car picked out. Now the cost of swapping it is going to come down to whatever it is, basically, and parts available for it. But you're going to need the same parts for most all cars. You're going to need a drivetrain, you're going to need mounts, you're going to need whatever it takes to fit it in the chassis, wiring, and accessories, and all the other pieces to put the thing together, and then the labor to do it. So we're going to break down some of them costs and kind of give you an idea of what kind of budget you need to complete a project like this. Here we go. So once you figure out your budget, the key is to pick all your parts ahead of time so that you have an idea of what kind of budget you have to spend, and then figure out what parts you can afford and what things you can get, and see if you can actually do it within your budget. But one of the big factors is going to be an engine. So we got crate engines, and we got junkyard stuff over there, some other crate engines. You could put an engine together, but I mean, an engine could be as low as $500 for a junkyard 4.8, or I don't know, $8,000 for an LS3 crate motor, or you could spend ridiculous money on a 454 LSX or something for 20 grand or 30 grand or whatever. But that's is a big factor in determining your budget, the engine that you choose. And we're going to do a video coming up on that, picking an engine and what would suit your project best. But on to the next subject. Now that you've determined what engine you're going to use, you need to pick a transmission that will suit that engine, maybe that drivetrain, whether it be like a 4L60 or a 400 or whatever it may be, or a stick. But you have to pick something that will suit the engine that you have chosen, horsepower wise, and maybe, RPM band or something. And rear end's going to be another option, another choice to make, whether what's in your car is going to work, but that's going to help determine transmission. Usually a good rule of thumb for transmission to rear gear is if you take first gear and multiply it by the rear axle, you want something 10 or 11 is the number you want to come up with. So that kind of helps picking rear gears. So another factor to consider in your budget would be horsepower. If you have a specific horsepower in mind, more horsepower, more money is usually the rule of thumb. Something like this, if you want a supercharger or a turbocharger or forced induction, these are things to maybe think about when you're doing a project, or maybe upgrades later once you get the swap done. Because don't forget, you can always swap the engine in there and put a blower or a turbo on it later. But you have to, if you're budgeting for that initially, you got to think about it. I mean, doing a regular LS swap, say your budget's 10 grand, add a turbo to it, add another 10 grand to that budget. And if you want more horsepower, add more money, because more horsepower, more fuel pump, more injectors, you know, you usually need a stronger engine, forged pistons, rods, things like that. So those are things to think about too. So you got to kind of have a horsepower in mind. So when building a project and thinking about a budget, you got to figure out what you're going to do with the car that you're building. Is the thing going to be a race car? Is it going to be a road race car? Is it going to be a drag car? Is it going to be a street strip car? Is it going to be something you can drive to the car show and show off? Or is it going to be a daily driver? So these are things you got to think about, because sometimes maybe you don't want 1,000 horsepower in your daily driver that gets 10 miles a gallon. So these are things to think about when budgeting for your swap. Another thing to consider is late model stuff like this S10 or GMC Sonoma. A lot of these things are going to be a lot cheaper to swap because it already has, so this thing basically already has an LS computer. So you can wire it in, you can make the gauges work. It's already got a fuel injection pump in it. All these factors are already done for you, and then you can integrate it into the electronics. So now you got to think, if you're doing an older car, most older cars with carburetors don't have fuel injection, so you have to put a fuel injection system in it, a tank with a pump, fuel injection line. Usually the gauges won't work. I mean, you can make them work, but you usually have to put something like Dakota Digital gauges in it. So that's another additional expense if you want gauges, which most people do when they drive their car. Things like that. And then also older cars are going to need potentially more maintenance. So you might get into a bag of worms. You start pulling things apart, and then you find things from the 50 years of service that car's been in, and it might need repairs or it might need maintenance that you didn't expect. So budget that into your budget. Another thing to think about is going to be doing the labor to do it. Now, whether you're going to pay a shop to do the swap for you or you're going to do it yourself, there's either going to be time or money involved in that. So to do a swap on a car, like say a muscle car, 69 Camaro or something like that, if you were just swapping the engine and it didn't need any extra maintenance or any extra things, which they usually do, sometimes they need wiring or suspension work or whatever it may be, I'd figure 100 to 200 hours to do a swap in an average GM type muscle car. If it's something exotic, it could be a lot more hours and a lot more fabrication. So consider that. I mean, at Next Gen Performance here, we get $100 an hour. So to do a pretty basic swap, you know, in something like that, it might be 100, 200 hours. So that's 10 to 20,000 bucks in just labor. And then on average, if you're doing a muscle car, your parts might be, depending on what you choose for engines and drivetrains, you might have 20, 30,000 bucks in parts to do the swap. So if you're doing it yourself, you're going to save that labor money, but consider, I do this every day, so it might take you twice as long as me to do it. So consider your 300 man hours. You know, say you spend 2 hours a night in the garage, add it up. You know, even if you do 20 hours a week, that's still 10. That's a lot. That's a lot of weeks. I mean, it could take a year or two to finish a project if you're doing it yourself. So consider that. All right, I'm going to leave you with this final tip. So Junkyard Motors, it may only be 500 bucks, say, for this engine, but don't forget about the cost, cleaning it up, regasketing it, and doing all these extra things. It could add up to as much as maybe buying something a little better with, you know, lower mileage, or even think about doing maybe a crate motor. But sometimes trying to save money, you end up spending more money.
And don't forget to budget for tires.